Berlin, March of 1943. The winter had barely lifted its grip from the city, and yet everything already felt weighed down by smoke, by fear, by the kind of silence that only comes when people pretend everything is fine. Somewhere deep inside the intelligence headquarters, in an office that always seemed dim no matter how many lamps were lit, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat alone. His close aides sometimes called him the conscience of Germany, though never loudly and never in public. He wasn't a loud man anyway. He carried himself like someone who had seen too much, thought too much, and trusted too little. That afternoon he unfolded a new report, thin, unassuming, the kind of document that could easily disappear inside a stack of others. But the moment he looked at the first page, he realized it wasn't like anything he had read before. The report claimed that, somewhere in America, a single factory was producing large four-engine bombers at a pace that sounded impossible, one every hour. It read almost like a rumor or propaganda meant to intimidate. Canaris had learned long ago to distrust exaggerations, but he had also learned to respect numbers that refused to bend. He ran his finger silently down the columns: projected output, workforce size, engine manufacturing, raw materials, fuel consumption. The numbers didn't waver. They lined up with everything his scattered network of agents had been whispering for months. At the top of the page was a name he had seen before, but never taken seriously until now: Willow Run. And if this place was only half as productive as the report suggested, Germany was on the brink of something disastrous. Canaris leaned back in his chair, the distant hum of Berlin muffled by the office's thick concrete walls. Outside, the city was still swelling with confidence. Headlines boasted of victories. Posters promised triumph. The people believed in speeches, in destiny, in inevitability. But Canaris believed in arithmetic. Berlin, March 1943. The city still carried the heavy gray of winter, even though the calendar insisted spring was coming. Coal smoke clung to the rooftops like a permanent shadow, and the streets, crowded but strangely subdued, moved with the routine of a country pretending it was still confident. Posters on the walls showed smiling soldiers and triumphant slogans, yet the faces of the people passing underneath them rarely matched the enthusiasm. Buried deep inside a fortified government building, far from the newspapers and loud speeches, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat alone in his office. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of an old wall clock and the scratch of a fountain pen he had forgotten to cap. The blinds were half drawn, leaving a thin, slanted beam of light across his desk, a desk covered with folders, maps, coded messages, and weeks' worth of intelligence summaries. Canaris had spent most of his life in shadowed rooms like this one, a veteran of the old Imperial Navy, a survivor of shifting political winds, and now the head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. To most people he appeared cautious, reserved, almost too quiet. But to the few who worked closest to him, he carried a reputation as something rare in that era, a man guided more by information than ideology, more by observation than blind conviction. They once half-jokingly called him the conscience of Germany, though none of them would ever dare say that outside a whisper. That morning, an envelope had arrived from a courier who didn't know what he was delivering. It looked ordinary, thin, unimportant. But the moment Canaris slid it open and saw the first paragraph, he felt a tightening in his chest. Inside was a report that described an American factory with a production capacity so enormous it sounded almost like myth. A facility that could produce a fully assembled four-engine bomber not over months or weeks, but every hour. Every hour. Even in the dim light of the office, he blinked at the absurdity. It didn't match anything he had ever seen or studied, not in France, not in Britain, not even in Germany's own proud industrial centers. His first instinct was to dismiss it, propaganda perhaps, or an exaggerated rumor drifting through neutral countries. But the report didn't speak like propaganda. Its tone was cold, technical, methodical. He began reading slowly at first, then faster, flipping between pages. Each line supported the next. Multiple independent sources, diplomatic chatter from Lisbon, trade manifests from Sweden, technical notes from industrial observers in Switzerland, all pointing back to a massive sprawling complex in the American Midwest. At the top of several pages, a name repeated over and over, Willow Run. He whispered the words under his breath, as if saying them might help them make more sense. He ran his finger down the columns of data. Estimated workforce numbers, machinery output, engine assembly rates, raw material flow, projected monthly delivery counts. It looked less like fantasy and more like factory math. And factory math, unlike political promises, didn't lie. Canaris leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Outside his closed door, officers moved through the hallways with polished boots and loud voices. They carried themselves with certainty that the war would bend to their will, certainty that victory was simply a matter of resolve. Berlin echoed with that kind of confidence. Newspapers printed victories in bold letters. Radio broadcasts promised that final success was just ahead. Even as shortages quietly crept into daily life, the nation convinced itself that determination alone could overcome anything. But Canaris had long stopped believing in slogans. He believed in tonnage, in production rates, in supply lines and resource maps. He believed in numbers, and the numbers in front of him painted a future very different from the one being sold to the public. He set the papers down, then picked them up again. He read them a third time, slower, tracing each figure. The logic was relentless. America, distant, untouched, and fueled by a seemingly endless supply of resources, was building something enormous, something Germany could not afford to ignore, something that, if left unchecked, could turn the tide of the war from the assembly line alone. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder now. He sat still for several minutes, staring at the folder, weighing the implications. If the report was accurate, Germany wasn't just facing an enemy across the ocean. It was facing an enemy with more factories, more manpower, more steel, and, most of all, more time. Canaris exhaled slowly and reached into a drawer for a fresh document sleeve. He knew this information had to be presented to the high command. He also knew exactly how they would react. They would laugh. They would dismiss it. They always did. But he prepared the report anyway, carefully assembling each page, making sure the data was clear and impossible to misinterpret. Even if they ignored him again, he needed it on record. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, holding the folder under his arm, the building bustled with busy officers, secretaries, and staff. No one paid attention to the quiet admiral passing by. No one noticed the weight of the papers he carried. No one realized that inside that thin file was information that could rewrite the entire course of the war. And as he walked toward the conference room, the confidence of Berlin pulsed all around him. But Canaris felt none of it. He knew he was walking into a room full of men who believed victory was inevitable. He also knew that arithmetic rarely cared about beliefs. The reports from neutral Europe. In the weeks that followed, Canaris became almost obsessed with one task, confirming, beyond any doubt, whether Willow Run was truly real or whether it was simply a rumor amplified by fear. He had been in intelligence long enough to know that even the most precise-sounding data could be built on a misunderstanding or a mistranslation. And so he turned back to the one resource the Abwehr still had that remained mostly untouched by political interference, its network of agents scattered across neutral Europe. 3 countries in particular had always been valuable: Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, each walking a careful diplomatic tightrope, trading with both sides of the conflict while pretending perfect impartiality. For spies, diplomats, and industrial observers, these nations were crossroads, places where information moved quietly, disguised as business reports, engineering notes, or idle gossip from traveling salesmen. The Swedish engineer's letter. One of the earliest confirmations came from Stockholm. A Swedish aeronautical engineer, one whom the Abwehr had quietly cultivated years earlier, sent a technical report disguised as a study on aluminum stress testing. Hidden within the dry engineering jargon was a short but astonishing paragraph describing a visit to an American supplier. The engineer wrote about a manufacturing plant in Michigan assembling aircraft wings with the same standardized precision used in the automobile industry. He described automated jig systems, conveyor-like movement of unfinished parts, and rows of workers, each performing a single repeated task with machine-like rhythm. It sounded nothing like the traditional European aircraft factories Canaris knew, places where craftsmanship and hand-fitting still dominated. This was something else, something new, something bigger. The whisper from Switzerland. A second report arrived from Zurich, carried through unofficial channels. A Swiss financial observer had overheard American procurement officers discussing long-term industrial output expectations. Buried inside the conversation was a reference to a production line so long that, in his words, it rivaled the length of a warship. Switzerland had seen nearly every kind of industrial plan cross its desks. Bankers and businessmen talked too much, but nothing like this. When Canaris read the note, he tapped his finger thoughtfully on the table. A conveyor line, longer than a warship. If it was true, the scale was almost unthinkable. The diplomat in Lisbon, but it was the message from Lisbon that truly unsettled him. Lisbon had become one of wartime Europe's busiest hubs of intrigue. Spies from every nation filled the cafes along the waterfront. Diplomatic hotels buzzed with whispered deals, coded telegrams, and information that traded hands as easily as cups of strong Portuguese coffee. One of Canaris's most reliable contacts, a diplomat whose identity even the Abwehr never wrote down, sent a cable describing an American industrial contract that mentioned Willow Run output acceleration. Buried in the memo was a production graph, simple but unmistakable, showing a steep climb in bomber manufacturing that dwarfed anything Germany had achieved. What shocked Canaris most was the diplomat's casual note at the end. If their current pace is accurate, they will soon treat bomber production like the automobile trade, abundant, routine, almost mundane. Mundane. The word lingered in his mind. Europe still treated heavy bombers like precious, delicate assets, machines that required careful assembly, experienced mechanics, and weeks of labor. Germany's aircraft factories took pride in precision craftsmanship, but precision took time. Time that the Reich was rapidly running out of. But America, according to these sources, was trying to make bombers as common as automobiles. The idea sounded absurd, and yet every new report supported the same conclusion. A pattern emerges. The more Canaris collected the fragments, the clearer the picture became. Individually, each report could be doubted, but together? They formed a pattern that pointed to one unmistakable truth. The United States wasn't just building an air force, it was building an industrial storm. And somewhere in Michigan, far from the battlefields, far from the bombed-out cities, stood the heart of that storm. Willow Run, a factory so large and so efficient that it threatened to reshape the meaning of warfare itself. Canaris laid the reports across his desk, aligning them side by side. Each one strengthened the last. They spoke with different voices from different countries, but they all whispered the same warning. Germany was no longer fighting a nation. It was fighting a production line. And production lines, once they reached full speed, were nearly impossible to stop. As he looked over the evidence, the reality settled in like a slow, heavy weight. This was the front Germany had ignored, the battlefield made of steel beams, conveyor belts, and thousands of workers whose greatest weapon wasn't bravery but efficiency. Outside his window, Berlin rolled through another restless night. But inside the quiet of his office, Admiral Canaris understood something the rest of the High Command refused to see. The war was shifting, not because of ideology, not because of strategy, but because one nation had turned its factories into an unstoppable force. And if Willow Run continued to grow, there would come a day when no amount of propaganda or confidence could drown out the truth. Canaris closed the folder gently. The storm was coming, and Germany had no shelter big enough to withstand it.